All right, we have finished Genesis. Dun, 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 dun. And we're going to be looking at the story of the Exodus. Now, it's the Exodus. We're not going to be looking at just Exodus. In fact, we won't be looking at all of Exodus, because a lot of Exodus is law. You know, sometimes when a person sort of enters the faith, you know, believes, you know, a person will say, read your Bible. Start reading your Bible, which is wonderful advice, because they will start with Genesis. And you know, we looked at it. Genesis is a great book to read, because you got all these little stories and a lot of action and a lot of movement, and it's great. And then you get into Exodus, and man, you got babies and baskets and burning bushes and plagues and all this, you know, this Cecil B. DeMille movie. This is good stuff. And then, boom, the law. And you hit the law. And you survive it through Exodus, the law. And then it gets so much better when you turn to the next book, which is Leviticus. And that's even better, because now you know where the priest is supposed to put the blood before he goes into...
Goes into what?
And yeah.
Now let me ask you, how many years did you study it before you got...
Good at it.
I'm going to tell you, to be honest with you, I don't know that other than in a survey class, I've ever studied Leviticus. In a survey class. I've read it, but I don't know. I bet the number of times I've read Leviticus, I could count on one hand.
Yeah.
Because Leviticus, if you were going to study Leviticus, find another hobby. There are so many other books to read. You know, there are so many other books to read. It's just not going to be relevant unless you are somehow doing a study in ancient Hebrew law. It just isn't relevant. And so we're not going to do that. We're not going to, and then, you know, when kids get excited and they start reading the Bible and they hit that law, what do? Almost 100% of the time, they stop reading it, right? Because it is boring. Yes, boring. And it's okay to call the Bible boring. That's all right to do. Because Leviticus is what?
Boring.
Boring. It is boring law. And so we're not going to do that. We're not going to look at the law, because it just isn't relevant to us as we live. But we are going to be picking out pieces of the narrative in Numbers, because Numbers will jump from law to narrative, the story. So we're going to be pulling, and you'll see that later. In fact, there's up on the bulletin board, there's an outline of what we're going to do in 10 sessions. We're going to go through, and that's why I call it the Exodus. We're not going to look at Deuteronomy at all, because Deuteronomy is another version of the law. It's not Levitical law, but it's another version of the law written by different people at a different time, but it is also there, but there's no narrative in it. And we're not going to look at the law there, although in Deuteronomy it's a little more interesting than Leviticus. Leviticus is painful to read. It is. It's
like
painful.
All the begats and so on.
Well, it's just every because one of the things that ancient people did, and it makes a lot of sense when you take a step back and look at it. If you want your people to do certain things, if I say, I am the king, I want you to do, this is my law, boom. You will probably do it because you're scared of me. But my power is really limited. So when you go back home and I'm not around and my police aren't around, you're going to do what you want. Maybe you'll do what I told you, but it's more likely that, you know, or there's an even chance that you're going to do what you want. If I say, God told me to tell you, this isn't my law, this is God's law. Are you going to do it? Yeah, because God sees you everywhere. At least you got a little more drive. That's right, drive to obey. And that's what we see. You know, and a lot of the law, most of the law makes sense, other than a lot of the priestly stuff. It really makes a lot of common sense. You know, why they would do it, you know, 2,000, 4,000 years ago. I mean, you don't eat shellfish when you don't have refrigeration, because shellfish will kill you. if it can't be refrigerated. Shellfish goes bad. So make it a law, but don't make it a law from me or make it a law from my Surgeon General, but make it a law from God. Then you're not going to eat shellfish. Okay, and that's what we see in a lot of the law. In the Old Testament, is how societies live together, how people live together in societies. That's why when you look at it in context, you got to be real careful when you say, well, it says here in Leviticus, it says there, we ought to do it. We've got to be careful, because if you turn a chapter, it says things that we do. We do all the time, and we don't even think about it. But it says here in chapter 10, well, chapter 11 says this, and we don't pay attention to that. Well, that's cultural, and well, that's a lot of baloney. You either deal with it all the same, or you deal with it all, you got to deal with it all the same. That's just what you got. You can't pick and choose.
And if you'd stop and think, which, on a daily basis, you don't really think about this part, is God knows every single move, thing, thought, what you say, thought, deed, whatever. Every single moment.
Right.
And, if you'd stop and think about that, we'd be a whole lot better people.
Well, we'd be a lot better if we paid attention to Jesus Christ.
Yes.
Because Jesus said the whole law and the prophets can be reduced to what? What did he say? He said the entire law and the entire prophets, all of it, can be reduced to two commands.
Love God.
Love God, love neighbor. God, neighbor. Boom. If you're loving God and you're loving neighbor, you're doing everything the law requires. Well, the law says this. Well, you're misinterpreting the law if you're using the law to hurt. To show disrespect to God or to hurt your neighbor. You're not reading the law right. That's your fault. That's not God's fault. That's what Jesus Christ said. Now, if I'm going to pay attention to Jesus, that's great. If I choose I'm not going to pay attention to him, okay, that's your business. But you might want to think real hard about calling yourself a Christian. If you're saying, I'm not going to obey Jesus, instead I'm going to obey something else, you might want to rethink the I'm a Christian business, because you're probably not.
Yeah,
You're probably not. But that's, again, between you and God, not between you and me. Now, when we get to Exodus, we've gone through Genesis. What is the situation? What we got a promise, right? And what was the promise that we had all the way through Genesis? We got, or I shouldn't say all the way through, from chapter 12 on. What was sort of the key in Genesis? Okay, good, boom. We got God and Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And there's a covenant established, right? We got a covenant. And what is the basis of the covenant? Okay, land. Okay, land. Well, you got two things. You got land and children, descendants, right? You got land and descendants. That's what God, because a covenant's a contract. That's what God's going to bring. That's what God is offering. And what does Abraham, Isaac, Jacob offer?
They obey.
Obedience and trust. Okay? Obedience, so you got land, descendants, obedience, trust. That's the covenant we've got. Now, when we get to the end of, so that's established, and man, the redactor, the one who organizes Genesis, has repeated it over and over and over again. And he's made it repeated to all kinds of people. Okay, bang, we got that. All right. Now, what's the situation of the people, the children of Jacob, or the children of, what was Jacob's other name? Israel. The children of Israel. Where are they? They are in Egypt. What's their situation?
They're crying out.
Well, at the beginning, at the end of Genesis, what is their situation in Egypt?
They've been given land, they've been given wealth.
They've been given land, wealth, land of Goshen. They've got all this good stuff. Why?
Because of Joseph.
Because of Joseph. Joseph saved Egypt, right? And so because of Joseph, Israel and his children are in Egypt. They've got good land. They're prospering. Everybody is happy as they go about their business. But we have an issue, right? Because they're prospering. The Israelites are prospering in Egypt But,
They're outnumbering.
well, right, before we get into Exodus, even before we even open Exodus, they're prospering in Egypt. What's the problem with them being so prosperous in Egypt?
It's not there.
It's not their land. It's not the land God promised. And the redactor, remember, as he puts the stories together, man, he emphasized that. That's why Joseph says, Jacob says, you got to bury me in the land. You got to bury me. Joseph says, when you go to the land, you got to take me with you, because this Egypt is not my home.
Why were they buried in Egypt when didn't they take Abraham back? Or was it Abraham or Jacob they took back to their own country to be buried?
I don't know. I don't know. Because Abraham was buried in the land.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking there was one that they took out of Egypt to be buried.
Oh, yeah, out of Egypt. Yeah, Jacob.
Egypt, right.
Yeah, they took Jacob. And remember,
Why didn't they take Joseph?
well, don't know. But Joseph said, made it his brothers, remember right at the end, promise.
Right.
Yeah, Jacob they did. But Joseph made his brothers promise. Now understand, when the time comes to go, you got to take me with you. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Don't know why he didn't do the same thing with Joseph that they did with Jacob.
And he even said they would.
Yeah, and they said they would. Yeah, they said they would. Okay, so that's where we are right as we enter Exodus, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as we enter Exodus, which tells us that we're probably not, the idea of having books, that's relatively late. This is a continuing story. That we break into books, or people broke into books later. But really, that's modern, if you're talking about modern being, a couple of thousand years ago. That we've got different books. The story flows, because as soon as we enter Exodus, what do we got right at the beginning? What does again, we're talking about a redactor bringing in different stories from different places. We'll see it today. Different traditions that he's combining into a narrative. What does he give us right at the beginning? He gives the children of Israel, right? So he establishes the children of Israel, connecting these two, the two works here. And what happens in Egypt?
The Israelites start outnumbering the Egyptians.
Well, but even before that happens, the writer tells us. So we got Israel or Jacob with all his sons. Joseph's already in Egypt. And then
Joseph and his brother.
What happened? Oh, Joseph and his brother
dies.
That generation dies. Now, so Joseph is now gone. His brothers are now gone. Certainly Jacob is now gone. And what is happening? Now what is happening? Now the children of Israel are...
They're getting a lot of them.
There's a lot of them. Procreating.
There you go.
They are procreating. Like rabbits.
Yeah.
There are Israelites everywhere, right? And they're not only multiplying, they're becoming...
overrunning the Egyptians.
Well, they're becoming really strong.
Yeah.
Strong.
So they're multiplying, and because we got to be careful. We'll get there in a minute. Which, as we read that, as the reader, we say the writer doesn't need to tell us why. Why are the children of Israel procreating?
Yes.
So effectively.
Yes. Lots of them. The Egyptians are worried.
Well, why is that happening?
Because God said they would prosper.
Okay, because God. Boom. Remember, we're talking about a biography of God here.
God.
This is God's story. So the Israelites are becoming successful not because they're really sharp people. It's because God is doing the same thing for them that he did for Joseph, right? He's blessing them. Now, verse 8, we have, and if you look at it like a story, boy, it makes it a whole lot easier. We got the introduction of what's called an antagonist. Mm-hmm. And who is introduced in it? A villain to this story. We got a new king in Egypt. And this new king, the only thing they tell us about this new king is what?
He didn't know Joseph.
He didn't know Joseph. And why is that, as we read the story, why does that become significant?
Because he's the one that notices how, realizing the deal.
Right, but he sees the Israelites increasing in number, but he doesn't know Joseph. And why is it so important that he doesn't know Joseph?
Because he doesn't know the story behind why they're in.
That's right, he
why they're
does.
there.
That's right. Doesn't know the story about why, doesn't know the story about how, doesn't know anything about Joseph saving Egypt, doesn't know Joseph. Now,
He doesn't realize God's intervention in Joseph.
Doesn't know.
So he
Doesn't
doesn't know that power that Joseph had.
Doesn't know.
Through God.
Yeah.
doesn't know Joseph.
Right.
You know, boom, doesn't know Joseph. Historically, doesn't know Joseph. Doesn't know Joseph. That's what we trust him. Now, with the writer says, doesn't know Joseph, doesn't know Joseph. So as he looks at the Israelites, what is he thinking?
He said they must be taken care of, put overseers over them.
Well, what is his concern?
He's afraid because they take over because
Yeah.
they're so strong.
Oh, there's so many of them here, right? So many of them here. If an enemy comes,
You turn on us.
they're gonna turn on us. Now, I think this is amazingly relevant. I mean, that's something that certainly modern Americans, probably Europeans too, can identify with pretty well. You know, what is the mindset? We got what? What's the problem that the new king sees in Egypt?
That the Israelites are becoming stronger.
We got too many
Israel.
foreigners. We got too many foreigners. And those foreigners are doing what?
Taken over.
Taking our jobs. Taking over.
He
They're,
wants control too.
they're getting too strong.
Yeah.
And if somebody comes and attacks us, those foreigners are going to do what?
Turn against him.
They're going to turn against us. You know, we got to protect ourselves, right? Oh, oh man. Okay. So that's what the king is saying. Man, I can relate to that. Because I can relate to it. So what do they do?
What does he do?
And notice when they say it, and this is going to be kind of interesting. It doesn't say, they don't use third person singular. So it doesn't say he did this. It says they did this. So what we're supposed to see, what the writer wants us to see is this isn't a concern that the king has, but everybody else is saying, oh, well, you know, I don't see a big deal about this. It's them. They see it. You know, same thing happened in Nazi Germany. Too many Jews running around. Got to do something, taking over. You know, and that's what they end up doing. You know, it's a they issue. And what do they choose to do?
Make them slaves.
Okay, they're going to make them slaves. They're going to use them to do what? Build cities. We're going to put them to work, wear them out so that they're not a threat anymore. We're going to get the most out of them as they can. But as they put this labor on them, work them harder, what ends up happening?
They will multiply even more.
They end up multiplying even more. You know, and why is that not a surprise?
Because they're kept together so much.
Well, yeah, that's Shelley, no, that's not the reason. Why is the reason? They keep on multiplying. God is with them. God is with them.
I know.
Yeah, I know. All right, so God is with the Israelites because they're his children. So, you know, so this isn't working. So and it's fascinating here. What does the king decide to do?
Work them harder.
Well, he works them harder, still doesn't work, right?
Right.
What does he decide to do?
Wants to kill the boys.
Okay, if we can eliminate the boys, but save the girls, then we can cut down on the number of what?
Foreigners.
foreigners. And it's really interesting because he uses the word, first time it's used to designate a people. They're called Hebrews. And I've told you before, Hebrews was really a derogatory term that referred to a social economic class. The word Hebrew literally means across water. Across
Really?
water.
Across water.
Yeah, across water. That's what a Hebrew is. And so for the Egyptians, the Hebrews were across. They were external. Everybody who was external is a Hebrew, is a foreigner. It's a Hebrew, and that. So it's not. This first time it's really being associated with Israelites, but Israelites and Hebrews, we're talking about really two different terms. Hebrew was a derogatory term. You didn't say, "Oh boy, I want to be a Hebrew." "Oh, I want to grow up and be a Hebrew." Hebrew meant you were designated in this certain class, and you were a slave, looked down on by Egyptian because of your position in society. Not necessarily, well, your race or your ethnic background, yeah, your language, yeah, but it was more a designated. And I'll use this. It's not a good term to use, but I remember hearing it a lot when I was growing up. It's when people talked about wetbacks. I mean, that's the same thing. That's exactly what it is.
Well, you're a southerner, so that.
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of other derogatory terms for other groups that my grandfather said every day of his life. But they came across the Rio Grande. They had wetbacks, and that's what Hebrew really means. They're from, and whether they did or not, literally doesn't matter. That's who they were. And so here we've got that idea introduced. Now but then they're not just going to, what's the deal with how are they going to get rid of the males?
The midwives.
The midwives.
To kill them.
You got the midwives coming in, and the midwives are going to just
Pretend the baby died.
Gonna take care of this business.
Well, make it die.
But what ends up happening?
The midwives couldn't kill the babies.
Okay, they couldn't do it because they feared God, and they wouldn't do it, and they let the boys live. Now, why did they let the boys live? They feared God. God's in control of this, right? And what is the explanation they give to Pharaoh or the king?
That the women had the babies so fast.
Which is a bunch of baloney.
Yeah.
Because they didn't do it because they couldn't.
Yeah.
They didn't do it because they chose not to, and God ended up blessing them or was with them. And so if this isn't going to work, what is the next step? Now we're going to just throw them in the Nile. We're going to throw them in the Nile. Now it becomes really significant because for the Egyptians the Nile is more than a river. I mean, the Nile is life. They worship the Nile because without the Nile they're dead. Life is the Nile.
They need the water.
Right. And so there's an irony here that this symbol of life is going to be used as the means of death. So again, a little subtle thing that the writer is throwing in here, kind of, brings into question, the motives of the Egyptians. And so now we've got two, and right here, I'm going to throw in we've got two forces right here introduced, contending with one another. What are the two forces? We've got the king, right, Pharaoh, and who's on the other side? God, right. We got God and Pharaoh. Pharaoh is working with power that is
His.
Earthly, right? And God working with power that is absolutely heavenly. Okay, so we've got this contest. Who's going to win this contest? Duh, it isn't really a contest. God's going to win. Okay, so we've got, this is the plan. What happens when we get to the very beginning of chapter 2?
Oh, chapter 10. The birth of Moses.
Okay, we got Moses, right? And what's the situation around Moses?
Well, his mother was able to hide him for like 3 months.
Okay, well, what is his background? Again, he's a Levite, because remember, the writer's going to tell us things, what the writer tells us must be important, because he doesn't have to. And he tells us things, and he tells us that his daddy is a Levite and his mom's a Levite, right? Now, why might that be important, not so much in the story right now, but to the people who are hearing the story later? That he's identified as a Levite, and we're talking about people who have already entered Canaan, have had their country, Judah and Israel. In fact, probably Israel's gone. Who are hearing this story. Why is the fact that he's a Levite? Why does that become important?
Is it because of the priestly order?
Okay, priestly order. Now, is it a priestly order here? Now? Heck no, because we don't have that now.
No.
That's going to come much later.
Correct.
So it has really no significance now in this story. But for the reader, it has a lot of significance. Because Levi, that's going to be the priestly order. And Aaron is going to be the founder. His brother is going to be the founder of the Aaronite priesthood, which is going to be important as they move into the future. So, the writer is telling the reader things that are important to him, but really aren't all that important to the people who are in the story right now. Okay, so what does the woman do? Gosh, how many times, Judy, did you tell the kids this story? A lot of times. Yeah, like maybe every year. Sometime. What does she do?
Puts them in a basket.
Puts them in a basket. Puts them in the Nile River. Interesting, the basket is made of papyrus. And, that's what they're writing on. I don't think there's anything to it, but it's kind of reminds us that they're writing on stuff you can use to make a boat. That's what they're using. They're not using paper, they're using papyrus.
It comes from wood, right?
Well, it comes from reeds. It's the skin of reeds. But it's a long process to get it so you can actually use it to write on. It's really expensive. So she makes it into this little boat, covers it with tar, puts it in the river. What ends up happening to little baby Moses in the boat? Pharaoh's daughter finds it, and when she says, she saw it among the reeds, and tells her maid to bring it, and she looks at him and says, "This must be one of the Hebrews." Now understand, when she says that, that's not, she's not, that's really a derogatory, Hebrew is really a derogatory term for the Egyptians. So that's not always these cute and sweet. Think of a, derogatory term. And that's kind of what she's saying. This is one of them foreigners. Foreign baby. But she's a princess of Egypt. So we would expect her, and she recognized, she says, "Oh gosh, this could be an Egyptian baby." No, she knows exactly, what he is, even though he's in a basket, knows exactly what he is. And so we would expect a princess of Egypt to do what? Certainly.
Send them back.
Yeah, push him off. Push him into the Nile. But what does she do?
Keeps him.
She keeps him, and his sister was sent to look, and his sister says, "Come over here, little girl." What up? So when she says we're going to take him, what is she in essence doing? This princess of Egypt.
Define.
She's breaking the law.
Yeah.
Breaking the law.
Oh, I thought
Why? Oh, and by the way, why is she breaking the law? Because God is in control. God is in control. God. We got to look at God behind everything in this story. So she says, the little girl says, "Hey, I know somebody that can nurse him."
Shall I go get her?
Yeah, and says, "Sure thing." And so Moses' mother comes and says, "Will you nurse?" And Moses' mother says, "Well, I don't know." And so she gets paid to nurse. Not bad deal. And it's not like Moses' mother comes with Pharaoh's daughter. She gives the baby to Moses' mother, and Moses' mother takes care of the baby until the baby is weaned, and so maybe 16, and does and does what? What does Moses gives it to Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh decides to name him Moses because he was drawn out of the water. Now see, that becomes kind of interesting, because Moses is going to be the leader of the Hebrews, which literally means over water. So the names, there's an irony in the names, that connection between the names.
Don't you wonder how she explained the having a child, you know?
What, Pharaoh's daughter?
Yeah,
And it doesn't mention it, which means?
it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter, that's right. Doesn't matter. You know, that's why it's hard to make movies on these stories, because it's not enough.
Yeah.
So you gotta have Charlton Heston growing up with, Yul Brynner around the castle, palace, right? You gotta have them doing, and having rivalries and wanting to date the same girls and, that kind of jazz. There's just not enough stuff in here to create a movie, and we don't have her motivation. She just does it. And that's all the writer wants, because it's not about her, and it's actually not about him. It's about
God.
It's about God. It's about God, who has his hands behind all of this. And the reader knows this. Okay. Now, all of a sudden, Moses grows up. Not unlike, kids in soap operas. Since Debbie is on vacation, she's a Young and the Restless girl.
Okay.
She's watched The Young and the Restless since the 80s. And Victor is still on The Young and the Restless since the 80s. Yeah.
Eddie Main's back.
Yes. Okay, Young and the Restless?
No, it's a general hospital.
Oh, General Hospital. Well, Debbie has no interest in General Hospital. In fact, she's an anti-General Hospital. Yeah, she doesn't.
I never watched the.
Oh, Young and the Restless. And, one of the things, but it happens in General Hospital too. You have, somebody has a baby, right?
Yeah, tomorrow.
And all of a sudden, in 2 or 3 weeks, it's a child. And then the child is sent off to school, always sent off to school, and then 6 months later,
You can graduate.
they come back as adults and now enter the story. And in The Young and the Restless, they come back as adults and they start dating Victor. So it's, it's...
If it's a girl.
If it's a girl, that's right. That's got to be real clear of that. And start drinking heavily, because that's usually what they spend a lot of time doing. Not working much, but talking an awful lot. So this is sort of what happens here. So fades to black, all of a sudden fades in. We're looking at a grown man, right? And what happens when he, as a grown man, what happens?
He flees to Midian.
Well, even before that, you're right. But what happens? Why does he flee to Midian?
Because he saw his people.
Yeah, now that's interesting. It says he saw his people, which means what?
He knew what it was.
But the writer doesn't tell us anything, about how he. But clearly he did.
Yeah.
And he knew, and what he sees is
Them beating
his people, and who were his people?
The Hebrews.
Hebrews, which really important, because the writer doesn't say he saw one Israelite beating another. It was Hebrews in this class. One Hebrew beating another. And so he identifies with Hebrews. He sees himself as a Hebrew, as a slave, as a foreigner, as someone from across the river, the other side of the river, right? And what ends up happening? He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And what does he do?
He goes and pulls them off the man
and kills. He kills the Egyptian, and the writer goes into detail. He kills an Egyptian and does what with him? Buries him in the sand. And they're going to show, by the way, they're showing this on Dateline on Friday, this story. No, it's not. It's the kind of thing they show on Dateline, buried in the sand. Only it's going to take them 2 hours to tell this little paragraph story. So he kills and buries him in the sand. Then what happens?
He saw one Hebrew fight.
Because, this is the only reason the writer tells us that he did this, because he sees 2 Hebrews fighting, right? Mm-hmm. And he says,
Why are you
guys,
hitting your fellow Hebrew?
we're on the same team. You shouldn't be fighting. We should be uniting, right? Uniting, union man. Yeah, we need to come together. We're union people. We don't want to be fighting with one another. We want to be united, join ranks and face the common enemy, right? Management, Egyptians. That's right. You dealt with a lot of Egyptians in your career. Okay. The Hebrews say,
who made you boss?
which is exactly, which somebody may have said to you at some point in your career. Who made you boss? And then really kind of snide, and this is one of the things I can really identify with, because I heard this and a lot and just growing up. What does he say? Who made you boss?
Yeah, and then he says about him killing me. Are you
gonna kill me like you killed the Egyptians? The Egyptian, and Moses says,
afraid. Yeah, he was afraid.
Yeah, if he knows
what he did would become known.
Yeah, and evidently what he did becomes known, because what does Moses do?
He leaves.
He beats it out of town and he goes to the land of Midian. He goes to Midian. Now, does anybody know where Midian is?
No.
It is on the it's in the northern part of the northwestern part of the Arabian Peninsula. So if you have Egypt here, and then you've got that triangle, Sinai here, Red Sea down here, Midian is right there. So it's not in Egypt, it's close, but between the Nile and Midian, you got the Sinai Peninsula, right there. So Midian is pretty far away. I mean, that's not in the neighborhood. That's not just bordering. Well, it borders Egypt, but not the Nile, not the Goshen. It's not really close to Goshen. Okay, so he ends up going to Midian, right, which is way over. And what happens in Midian?
Well, some of the daughters came to feed their animals and they were chased out.
Ooh. I'm experiencing deja vu.
Yeah.
Daughters at a well?
Yeah.
Have we seen that before? Yeah, boy. How many times have we seen it before? At least twice. Because we had a Rebecca at the well, and we had a Rachel at the well, and now we have these other daughters at the well. And what happens in this little well singing?
Well, he rescued them and let them watered their flock.
Okay, he kind of gets rid of the bullies, lets them water the flock, and what do the girls do?
Went home and told them.
They run home and tell Daddy, and who is Daddy? Reuel. And the fact that it's got an E-L at the end, Al, means the name has something to do with God, because that's what it means. He tells Reuel that this guy, and they identify him as, they don't identify,
It's an Egyptian.
they identify him as an Egyptian. This Egyptian has come, because, Midian is really on the other side of the water. That's the kind of people the Egyptians don't like, they're on that side of the water. And that he's an Egyptian, and then what does he say to his daughter?
You'll bring him here.
Okay, bring him here, and as a thank you, which is, thank yous have changed, nowadays. If a man did that, father might give him a card, a nice little card, or might give him a basket of fruit, which would be nice. Maybe a gift certificate.
You can marry my daughter.
Yeah, and he gives her one of the daughters, and so they end up getting married. Zipporah ends up getting married, and they have a son
Named Gershom.
Gershom, and they are, because he's in a foreign land, and now what is Moses' situation?
He thinks he's an alien.
Okay, he is living in Midian, which is not his land. And Midian isn't part of Palestine either. So he's an alien in both senses. He's not in Egypt, but he's not in Palestine either. He's in Midian. Okay, what happens in Egypt? As all of this is going on, what's going on in Egypt?
They're crying out.
Oh, they're crying out. First, the king dies,
Yes.
which is a reminder of who has absolute power. It's not the king, it is God, because kings live, are born and die. And the Israelites, now we're back to Israelites, not Hebrews. The Israelites, because the writer wants to remind us that we're really still talking about the children of Israel. The Israelites are groaning out in slavery, and they cry out. Hebrews wouldn't cry out to God, because there are all kinds of gods that the Hebrews would follow, because that's a social economic class. Hebrews, so they may have a lot of different religions. These are the children of Israel, therefore they have a God. El.
What, honey?
They have their God. So they cry out to the God, and God does what?
He hears them. And he
He
answers.
hears them, and he
Answers.
Well, between hearing, you're right. He hears and he answers. What's between?
Remembers.
He
remembers his
remembers,
covenant.
and he remembers the covenant, which becomes important for us, the reader, right? Because when the writer says God remembers the covenant, who else remembers the covenant?
The people.
Oh, we do. The reader remembers. Oh, yeah. Because it's been a long time since we talked about a covenant, right? We remember that there was a covenant between God and his people. Okay? And the covenant involved what again? What were the parts to the covenant? God's side?
Abraham and Isaac and Jacob.
Right, then to the fathers, the patriarchs. And what is God going to bring to the table? What is God offering? Land and descendants. What do the children of Israel offer? Obedience and trust. Okay, so we're reminded of that covenant. Okay, now we're going to go back in chapter 3 to who?
Moses.
Moses. And what is Moses doing?
Tending a flock.
Tending a flock by his father-in-law,
The priest of Midian.
priest of Midian, whose name is
Jethro.
Jethro. You look puzzled, Janet.
Yeah.
Yes. Why are you puzzled?
Because up here,
Yes, it's a different name. Now, what does
Yeah.
that immediately tell you?
it's a different writer.
Different writer, different tradition. He's drawing on different traditions. Now, see, if you want to, go for it. Go for it. If you want to come up with something really, really elaborate to explain why the guy has one name here and another name here, if you want to do that, go for it. I'm sure you could find whole books written on why, Ruel is given one time and Jethro someplace else. I think you're just drawing for different traditions. We've seen the same thing happen before. This is not the first time we've encountered a different name, right? Heck, we've dealt with different names for God, before. So it's not a big deal if you just look at it that way. But if somebody wants to make it a big deal, that's their business, not mine.
In this explanation in this Bible, it says that it may not have been unusual at that time to have 2 or more names. Some think Jethro may have been a formal title rather than a name, which perhaps meant His Excellency. So
Yeah, who knows? I wasn't there. Who knows? It could be. We know too, which is kind of interesting, when this story continues, Lord is used again. And that may tell us that we are drawing from maybe a different storyline. That we've got these two, like we saw in Genesis, these stories. And we're not worried about it. We're more worried about what's said here than that kind of stuff. That's something we're not going to get gummed up on, because it's just not, I don't know that it's all that important. Okay, so, and he's where? Where is he?
You talking about Moses?
Yeah, where's Moses?
He's up on that mount, the burning bush.
He's on a mountain
With the burning bush.
on Horeb, right? Horeb, the mountain. Now, there's a problem with Horeb, the mountain. Horeb is not in Midian. Horeb is not in Midian. It's on the Sinai Peninsula. So technically it's in Egypt, but it's not in Midian. Now that's going to become important because it talks about wilderness. This is the writer dropping this beyond the wilderness, dropping in this idea that they're going to spend time in the wilderness, and it's not going to be in Midian, it's going to be on the Sinai Peninsula. So Moses is there. How he got his flock from Midian over there is, I don't know. That's a long way, but that's okay. I'm not worried about it. The writer says it. I trust the writer. That's what I'm going to do. So he is there, and all of a sudden he sees what?
The bush on fire.
The bush on fire. And what makes that flaming bush significant?
Because the bush isn't actually burning.
The bush is not being consumed. And it is an angel of the Lord, right?
Lord.
It is an angel of the Lord. Okay. And what happens as Moses encounters this burning bush?
God calls him from the bush.
Okay. He ends up identifying, talking,
To
the
him,
voice
yes.
from this bush. And how does God identify himself?
He tells him not to come any closer because it's a place of.
Okay, this is holy ground, so you don't want to get closer. And what else does he say?
I'm the God of
Okay, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Okay, and he does what is appropriate to do in the face of the divine.
He hid his face.
Covers his face because you don't look onto God. And what does the Lord say?
He said he's seen the misery of
Okay.
all his people in Egypt.
Okay. He is seeing the misery of his people. And what has he come to do? Or what will he do for these people?
He says he's come to rescue them.
Okay, he's going to come to rescue them. And how is he going to rescue them?
He's going to
send Moses.
Okay, he's going to send Moses. And what is he going to do for the people? And again, he's talking about what people?
his people.
Israelites.
And he's
He's
gonna
talking about
take
Israel.
to a land of milk and honey.
Okay, going to lead them into a land of milk and honey. And just so that we know what the land he's talking about, he says this land now inhabited by Canaanites and Hittites and Amorites and, okay, all the other ites. There was some termites there. So it was a lot of people in this land, right? And God was going to lead them to the land. Now, that's not a shocker, right? Because God remembered the covenant, and the covenant involved
Land.
land. And he's going to fulfill the covenant. He's going to bring the people, bring them out of Egypt. And we're going to accomplish this. I'm going to accomplish this by doing what? I'm going to accomplish this by sending you. And Moses responds,
I can't do it.
I can't do it. I can't do it. What does Moses, and God says to Moses, yeah, you're going to do it. Because why are you going to do it?
I'm going to be with you.
Because I'm going to be with you, and this mountain that is in Sinai, right, is going to be important. And we know it's going to be important later in the story. But right now, this mountain is going to be important. It's stuck in the middle of the wilderness. The children of Israel didn't wander through Midian. They wandered through Sinai. So this mountain is going to be important. You're going to bring my people out. And what does Moses want to know?
Shall I say something?
Okay, he says, you got to give me your name, right? Now, why is it important? Why would that be something he would want to know? Why is that something that's important to know? Name.
He says, I am who I am.
Well, that's what the Lord's going to say. But why is it important for Moses to know? Look, guy, burning bush. You got to tell me who you are. Why would that be something he would want to know?
Because if he's going to do this, he's going to have some help.
Well, going to have some help.
But the people have got to recognize that it comes from God. Not
Yes.
Yeah,
Moses.
we even see that now.
Right,
If I'm working in the name, I'm going to go someplace, but I'm going as an agent for somebody else. And that's what we're talking about. Moses is going to be the agent of
God.
God, going to be God's agent in a sense. And that's why the name of God, and that's why the Hebrews or the Jews were so important to preserve the name of God. And not say it, because when you use the name, you were suggesting power and agency. That I am now God's agent. I am working in his name. Therefore, I'm claiming his power, which no human being has the right to do unless a burning bush has talked to you and sent you. So I guess if you see a burning bush that isn't being consumed, then you can be an agent of God. If you haven't, maybe you should refrain from talking about, I am doing this in God's name. You're suggesting an awful lot about yourself.
Right, and the people were under such bondage for so long. One single man in their brain, in my brain, could never just free them. It had to have that faith and belief that it was God that was moving this mountain to do it. So he had to know, should I say, sent me.
This is God's story. This is God's story. That's why the historicity almost gets in the way, because this is God's story. It's not movement, people uniting, a social revolution. This is God's story. And that's where we want to keep that focus, is on God. In fact, historically, it's really hard to ground this. And Egyptians were really good at keeping history. This really isn't grounded in Egyptian history, which is good. I don't have a problem with that. That makes it more powerful. I don't have to get, history gumming up this story. Okay, so what's your name? And what name does God offer from the bush?
I am.
He says, I am who I am. Now, Hebrew is a little tricky, because Hebrew doesn't have a future tense, which seems odd, to have a language that doesn't have a future tense, but Hebrew doesn't. And so to determine future, you've got to look at context. Whether they're talking about the present or whether they're talking about the future, it's based on context. English has a future tense, Hebrew doesn't. It just has two tenses, past and present. And so no future. So it can be, you could translate it, I am who I am. It could be, I will be who I will be. Don't know, because in Hebrew there's no future tense. What is important, though, is how the Greeks translated it, at least for Christians later. And the Greeks translated this, ago me. Ago me, that's in Greek, I am. But it's not just, if you said a me, that's enough. A me means I am. But ago me, you're adding the pronoun, which you don't have to do in Greek. It makes it emphatic. It means I myself am. It draws attention to the pronoun, I am. And that becomes significant, particularly in the Gospel of John, because Jesus will 7 times say, I am the good shepherd. I am the gate to the sheepfold. I am the vine. I am, the way, the truth, and the light. And each time he says it, he says, ago me, which is the identification of God from the burning bush. Now, I think as John uses that, as he shapes it, that becomes really significant. His audience knows what Jesus is doing. He's not just talking about himself. He's claiming the name of God. He's claiming the name of God. And so that becomes really pertinent. And certainly the evangelist John saw that as being really, really important. But that's what God says. I think theologically it's significant too. And in Greek, ago me is present, because Greeks have future tense. The Greeks have more than future too. They have perfect as well. But they have future tense that God is eternally in the present. God is always present. I am. I am tomorrow. I am yesterday. I am today. He's always present, which kind of speaks to his eternity. Okay, that's what he says, and this is going to be his name forever. And it's not a shock that those 4 letters, that are the proper name of God, that's what the voice said. Those letters. Only when the Hebrews wrote them, they didn't put vowels, so you can't pronounce it. But that's what God said. That's the proper name of God. And no Hebrew would say that out loud. You wouldn't say it out loud. No Hebrew, no Israelite, no Jew would say that out loud. Because that's the name of God you'd be claiming. That's why, if a person wants to do it, that's fine. But when you see translations where they talk about Yahweh or Yahweh, what you're doing is you're trying to pronounce that name for God. No Jew would ever, ever, ever do that. Because when you use God's name, you're claiming his authority. And wow, you don't want to do that. And that's why when they hit those letters, they would say Adonai. Jews would say Adonai, which means Lord. And that's why in your English Bibles, you've got Lord in uppercase when those 4 letters appear. You'd never say the proper name of God. That's just, you wouldn't do it.
The Church of God, where my sister goes, has on their walls all the names of God.
Yeah.
Yahweh, and I can't remember all of them, but
Historically, and that's fine. And like I said, if somebody wanted to do, that's fine. You know, if that, to me, for the Jews, that name was so important. You never wanted to say it out loud. And so sometimes I get uncomfortable when I hear that. I won't do it. But then, you know, that doesn't make it right or wrong. I just don't feel comfortable because that was a holy name. That was so incredibly special. You know, for me to say it seems to be showing a little disrespect to them. And by the way, the word Jehovah isn't a Hebrew word at all. That's a manufactured word. That's taking the consonants from this and adding the vowels from Adonai. You take the vowels from one word and you add it to the consonants of another word and you get Jehovah. Jehovah doesn't exist. That's not a Hebrew word. That's a manufactured word. So
talk about Jehovah there too.
yeah, Jehovah's wouldn't. Yeah, that's doesn't exist as well. I mean, if you want to call God Jehovah, that's fine. You know, but it doesn't exist as in any language. That's not a word from a language. Okay, but that's what he says from the bush. He identifies himself, and this is going to be the name. Again, I told you when we were looking at Genesis, envision a guy talking to his little boy. And the little boy says, why is God referred to by those 4 letters? Well, let me tell you the story of Moses in the burning bush. This was what the Lord said that's what Adonai said, was then his name. Okay, so what specifically is Moses going to do? Specifically, what is he going to do?
Going to go to the king.
Well, even before he's going to the king. Because God, after he identifies himself, gives him a game plan, right? Mm-hmm. You are going to first do what?
You're going to say to the Israelites that the Lord, the God of their fathers.
Right. You're going to get the people together, the Israelites together, right? The leaders together. And you're going to tell them what?
That it's the God of their God. Oh, crap, I don't know what I want to say. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me. Okay,
so you're going to go to the leaders of Israel, and you're going to tell them this is what and it's just what God had already said, right? Mm-hmm. To Moses, this is who he was, and this is what he decided to do, and then he's going to go to the king, right? Mm-hmm. And what do you do? What is Moses going to do when he goes to the king? Which is fascinating. What is Moses going to do when he goes to the king?
Going to ask him that they can go out and worship God.
Yeah, he doesn't say go to the king and tell the king that the Israelites want to worship. Mm-hmm. Go to the king and say the Hebrews want to worship. Right. Because Israelites mean nothing to the king. That's not an identification he uses at all. So you're going to say these foreigners want to go out and worship. Worship their God. Okay. And how does Moses respond in chapter 4?
This is what they don't believe.
Now, we can look at this in 2 ways. We can either say that Moses is being obstinate, and that's okay. Maybe that's the intention of the writer. He's not here. I can't ask him. It could also be the writer's using Moses to have God explain what's going to happen. If Moses didn't ask these questions, we, the reader, wouldn't know. we wouldn't know what's going to happen, right? So the only way we can know what's going to happen is for Moses to ask the question. That's not unusual. Like if you watch a movie, they call it exposition, where sometimes all of a sudden a character will say, well, wasn't that the same guy that, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, so out of the blue. Well, the writer of the movie needs that to explain what's going to happen next. He needs somebody to give exposition, right? This could be what the writer is doing. So Moses may not just be a jerk or a coward, all this kind of stuff. This allows the writer to explain what's going to occur to us, the reader. I would suggest you look at it this way. That's the way I look at it. But if you want to see it as a reflection on his character, that's fine. Maybe it is. I don't know. I don't have the writer here in front of me, so I have no way to know for sure. But it sure seems like these questions, each one allows the voice to explain more stuff. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. And so Moses asks, what if they don't listen to me? And then he does, what does the voice say?
Gives him a rock.
Okay, I'm going to give you 3 signs, right? I'm going to give you 3 signs. First, you got a staff in your hand, right? What's going to happen with your staff?
Make it do things.
Okay, well, first thing you're going to do is you take that staff and throw it on the ground, and it becomes
A snake.
a snake. Now we say, ooh, a snake. Well, why a snake?
Well, the Egyptians worshipped it.
Well, yes, snakes were really important in the ancient world because snakes are a symbol of the earth. That's an earthly symbol. Again, it makes logical sense. Snakes often live in little dens under the ground. And so the snakes go into the ground. And so snakes are, and they're close to the ground. They're really close to the ground. Snakes become this symbol. And also, not only an earthly symbol, but a symbol of life and death. And that's why, on the medical sign has a snake on a staff. Because that's what it's a symbol of. And so turning it into a snake as opposed to turning it into a beagle has more significance, right?
Yeah.
Turning it into a beagle, everybody would say, oh, isn't that cute? Turning it into a snake, you go, whoa. And then when you grab it by the tail, it turns back into a staff. So it becomes really an important symbol that the Egyptians and agricultural people who are centered around life and death and the ground, becomes really, really significant. And then, what's the other sign? His hand. Put your hand in, becomes leprous,
okay.
and then put it back, and it's healed. Why is that really important?
Well, lepers were cast out.
Lepers, that's bad news, right? And later, according to the law, lepers were not only people who were really sick, but lepers were unclean. They were spiritually unclean. And leprosy encompassed a lot of diseases. A bad case of acne might be considered leprosy. So eczema might be considered. Leprosy was a big category. So now it's very, very narrow. Then it was big. Because a lot of people got over it. Because that's what, you were healed. That's why he said go to the priest. So getting over leprosy was not an unusual thing in the ancient world. So it wasn't like leprosy, what we identify leprosy now. Now it's a bacterial infection. They had no concept of bacteria then. So it was a skin disease, general skin disease. But you put it in, take it out, healed, really important, symbolically important. What's the last one?
Water.
Take some water from the Nile and pour it on the ground, and it becomes blood on the dry ground. And that becomes significant because the Nile is considered life. Is considered God. They sacrificed to the Nile because the Nile, they relied on the Nile to live. And it's interesting that it would turn into blood, which makes a lot of sense because to the Jews, particularly later, life is blood. Life is blood. That's why you didn't want to touch blood, because life certainly didn't consume it, because that's life. So these are signs. So if you do these signs, the Egyptians are going to listen to you. And Moses then says what?
That he isn't a good speaker.
I'm not a good speaker, which gives the Lord the opportunity to say what?
That he would give him everything he needed.
Well,
Come out of his
yeah,
mouth.
and in particular who or whom?
God gave him your
brother Aaron.
Yes, okay, God, Aaron is going to speak to you. You know, a father telling his son says, you know, why do we believe the priests are descendants of Aaron? Well, let me tell you, son, you know, about the voice from the bush. You know, this becomes an explanation of why things are the way they are. That's why Moses and Aaron are Levites, because that's what they're going to be. Aaron's going to be the father of the Aaronite priests. Okay,
But God gives the word to Moses. He says,
Yes.
I will be with you, Moses.
Right.
He gives Aaron to be, so Moses is going to give it to Aaron. Aaron's going to be the speaker because he's eloquent.
which becomes really, really interesting. Because what is that suggesting, not just about Aaron, but about the Aaronite priests? That might be important, really be important later. Maybe even more important later than here. I think you're 100% right. Why does that become really significant? That Aaron is just going to be the spokesperson. It's just going to say the words. What is that suggesting about the priests?
For me, it's just that's what the priests are, the tools. God is the word.
I think that's exactly right. That the priests are not themselves divine.
Correct, yeah.
Or filled with the divinity. They become spokesmen for the divine. They become the intermediaries between God and humanity. And that really is established here. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that's one of the things we take away from this. The fact that Moses is special. The priests are not like Moses. The priests are not going to be descendants of Moses. They're going to be descendants of Aaron. And that becomes really significant. Okay. So this is going to be Aaron's role. Now, what does Moses do? Once he has this, once he's got all this information, and not only does Moses have it, who else has all this information?
He goes back.
Oh, we do.
Yeah.
We've got all this information. You know, so we carry this with us as we go into the rest of the story. He, of course, goes where first?
Back to his father.
Back to his father-in-law, Jethro, and he says, what?
Let me go back.
Let me go back. Jethro says,
Go, and I wish you well.
you know, go. And so he takes his wife and puts him on a donkey and heads back to Egypt. And the writer makes sure we know he's carrying what? He's carrying his staff. And what does the Lord say to Moses? Which again becomes not exposition of what's happened, but something that we can anticipate later. What does the Lord say to Moses as he's going his way?
To go back to Egypt for all the men who wanted to kill you were dead.
Okay. And I'm going to call out my firstborn, which are the Israelites, to the king, and ultimately it's going to cost their firstborn. You know, their firstborn. And also he's very clear so that we, the reader, know what's going on. And this, I think, a lot of people misunderstand. In the same way, I think they misunderstand the parable of the soils that Jesus tells. Later, we'll look at it next week. But the Lord says it right here. So we already know what's going to happen when Moses goes to Pharaoh. When Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go, what is Pharaoh going to
He
say?
performs all kinds of things.
He's going to say,
No.
he's going to say no. Why is he going to say no?
God's going to harden his heart.
God's going to harden his heart, which means Pharaoh couldn't say
Yes.
yes.
Correct. I love the way
Pharaoh couldn't
God
say yes.
tells Moses, be sure you go and do everything I tell you to do, but it's not going to work.
Right, exactly.
So he lets him know ahead of time. He says, okay, this is my plan. Just keep going with it. It won't
That's
look
right.
good.
And it's going to be hardened heart. And remember when we looked at Romans, Paul sees this as really important in the 9th chapter of Romans. Because, and it's one of these things that he's telling the Romans. Now, that sounds unfair to you, right? That God hardened Pharaoh's heart, which meant Pharaoh couldn't do anything other than what Pharaoh did. That seems unfair. Well, no, it's not unfair. If Barb were here, I would say, look at her and say, Barb, what was God's intention in Romans? Mercy, compassion. Pharaoh, he's doing this with Pharaoh in order to be merciful and compassionate to who? To Pharaoh and his descendants. Because it's going to be through this that the Messiah is going to come. The Savior of the world is going to come because God caused Pharaoh's heart to be hardened. And that's going to be, for Paul, that's really essential. This is God working out his plan. Do we understand it? Heck no. Would we have done it that way? Heck no. But does God do it that way?
Yes.
Yes.
Why?
Because he's
Because he's God. Because he's God. And God has never said, Ed, what do you think I should do tomorrow? Because if he did, I got some suggestions.
And every little thing he does encompasses everything.
Yes. And that becomes Paul's point. You can't look at what's happening now because we're part of something that's eternal. Yeah, it's something that's eternal. So, you can't judge things based on 24 hours. Everything is eternal. You can't even judge it on a lifetime or a decade or an eon. Okay, so this is what he tells us. He tells Moses, he tells us, before it even happens, exactly what's going to happen. Moses is going to do stuff. Pharaoh's going to say no. Why? To show my glory. Okay. Now, they're on the way, and then an odd little story. This little tiny story that really is weird. And I'm never going to preach a sermon on this little story. And it is certainly not a story, Judy, you ever taught to your kids. Between the burning bush and the plagues, you did not tell the story about the foreskin. No. Why? Because it's weird. What happens in this little story, because it says the Lord, and I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. The Lord wants to kill him now. I don't understand it. I got no answers for you. I'm sorry. I know what I can interpret. I think I can figure out why it's there. Because what ends up happening? The Lord is really ticked off as Moses and Zipporah and little Gershom are heading to Egypt. And what ends up happening? The Lord tries to kill him, right? And what does Zipporah do?
She circumcised.
Takes out a knife and circumcises her son. And then, which is equally confusing, touches Moses' feet with the foreskin. Now understand, and I'm throwing this out, and I don't want to pursue it. Feet, that's a euphemism for something else. When in the book of Ezekiel, it talks about the angel with wings in Ezekiel, when it talks about the angel and his wings are covering his feet, it's because the angel is private. It is covering something else. When it says Ruth lay at Boaz's feet, it doesn't mean she was at the end of the bed. That's not what it means. It's a euphemism for something else. So when she touches his feet with the foreskin, enough said. I'll tell you later, Shelley. I'll tell you later. Anybody who wants to hear later, I'll tell you later. But
don't you wonder why that is here?
well, I think there's no mention of Moses being circumcised. And this becomes not only circumcision of the son, but it becomes his sort of spiritual circumcision. Or whether it inferred some kind of a mystical thing that occurred when she did it. I really don't know. I think it points to obedience, and that the writer wants to make sure that Moses and his whole family were where they were supposed to be. They were in line with the covenant, and they really hadn't established that before. That's the only thing I can figure why that. It's an odd little story, and I wouldn't get all bent out of shape or worry about it. But it's a weird story on a lot of levels. What does so once we're through that, what does the Lord say? Because the Lord has already said to Moses, your brother's coming out to meet you. Aaron's coming out to meet you. And what happens in verse 27?
The Lord sent Aaron to meet me.
Which tells us, again, like we're being bludgeoned with this, but it's important. Who is driving this story? God is driving this story. It is not, coincidence. It's not one deciding to do it and the other. It's not happy circumstances. God is driving this story, right? Okay. And so the narrator has established certain things about Moses, right? He is going to, what's Moses going to do? He's going to do what the Lord told him to do. He's going to speak to Pharaoh to get the people out. What do we know is going to happen? But he's not going to do it by speaking himself, although he has his staff, and he's going to do it hand in the Nile. He's going to do it through his spokesman, Aaron. And what do we know is going to happen? Pharaoh is going to say, no. We're going to see in one time, Pharaoh says, yes, go. And then it says, God hardened his heart. And there are plenty of people that would say, well, God, Pharaoh was just being anti, was just being ornery. Well, no, he was doing what Pharaoh had to do. Pharaoh didn't have a choice.
I think also Pharaoh feels very empowered. He's got control over all these people. He's kind of suppressed them. Mm-hmm. And so I think he feels like a self-god himself, maybe. And he says, I don't have to, what is he going to do? And so God keeps proving his majesty, his power.
Oh, absolutely.
Throughout the whole.
Well, that's what he'll say. I'm doing this to display my kavod.
Correct.
Kavod. Yeah, because this is what it's all about. And Paul will say the same thing. And God's intention is always mercy and compassion. It's not that he hated Pharaoh, was going to dump on Pharaoh, but mercy and compassion. That's why God did it. The way he did it. So anyway, that's what we've got. Now we're going to have, next week we're going to move in to him talking to the people. And again, we're going to go through a lot of material because we can, because the plagues are just boom, 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 boom. Will you let my people go? No, plague. Will you let my people go? No, plague. Will you let my people go? Yeah. Now that I thought of it, no, plague. And, so that's what we're going to get. We're going to get that for a while.
You know what kind of struck me in the beginning, in the chapter 1, that says in Run 10, how the new king comes on board, Pharaoh, and he fears the Hebrews, God's children. He fears them because of their... So, isn't that true in life with the enemy himself? He fears God's children, so he tries to oppress us.
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's on
So that just really struck me as like, what was a story back then is very true in today's world with us.
Oh, absolutely. I think you can look at it on a lot of levels. I think but it becomes kind of an irony here. It becomes a little ironic because here's an individual that would claim complete power. The king is complaining, and yet he's not only is he afraid, which shows a lack of power, but he can't really address it, has no power to address it. But we're constantly reminded that he actually doesn't even have the power to make the decision. He doesn't have the power or the freedom to make the decisions he makes. God is in control of those decisions.
And that's what is our hope today.
Yeah.
In our life.
Absolutely.
God is here.
Yeah, absolutely.
No matter what this does around us, we have that. So that just was just very hopeful to me. That's just like, wow, yeah, that's strong.
And I think this is why this has become such an important story for the people later. Because it's, a reminder that God is always in control. And that was in Genesis. God's in control. God's will's going to be done. We may not like it, but His will's going to be done. And that's what Jesus said.
He's the alternative.
That's why it's so important to be within that will, to do what God has called you to do, and that's to love God and love neighbor. It ain't rocket science.
Love your enemy.
Yeah, love you. Well, that's what love means. You want to know what love means? 1 Corinthians 13. Read it. Not boastful or rude. That's what love is. Patient and kind. That's what it is. So you want to be loving, do it. Do it. You can do that to somebody you dislike. You can be kind to people you don't like. You don't have to like them. So.
Well, that's what I said about your family,
Yeah. What about my family?
Your son.
What's wrong with my family?
If your son marries somebody that you don't particularly like,
Yeah.
if you want to be in your daughter's life and have her in yours, or your son, whatever,
Right.
you might not like who they married, but you have to respect the fact that that's who they love and they married, so
Yeah, that's except my daughter. Yeah, that's the exception, because if she marries a bum, I'm not gonna like it. I've already decided.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not gonna.
I mean, you can talk to them before they marry that person,
Yeah.
but if that's their decision,
Doesn't
what are you
do
gonna
any
do?
good.
Yeah, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna sell him to an Ishmaelite.
Oh, okay.
That's what I'm gonna do. Sell him to an Ishmaelite.
That's a good line.
Yeah,
Good thing to do.
that's a good thing to do, especially if he's got a lot of tattoos and he's riding a motorcycle.
Piercings.
Piercings. Multiple piercings. Multiple piercings. Yes, and skinhead. Going to sell him to an Ishmaelite.
Those of us who don't want to be skinheads end up, they shave it off on purpose.
Especially if he's got a skin, and his head is tattooed.
Yes.
The skinhead, and that's tattooed.
Yes.
Yeah, that was not good.
Ishmaelite. Sell him to an Ishmaelite. Okay, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for helping us see how your will is continuing into the book of Exodus. Help us to recognize that as we live our lives, that you are the one that's ultimately in control. It may not appear that way today, may not appear that way tomorrow, but that doesn't change the fact that that's the way it is. So help us trust, and through that trust, help us feel confident as we move forward doing what you have called us to do in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.